This is the second of two World Sociology screencasts analysing the role of transnational organisations. So in the first screencast we looked at different types of transnational organisations, and then we analysed the role of the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO. What we're going to do in this screencast is focus on the role of non-governmental organisations, and particularly the role of transnational corporations. So transnational corporations, or TNCs, are sometimes also called multinational corporations, or MNCs, and what we're talking about are very large companies that operate in many different countries, and in economic terms the biggest transnational corporations are often larger than nation states. So what we see in this diagram are the top 100 economies in the year 2011, and only 60 of those top economies were in fact countries. 40 of the top 100 were in fact transnational corporations rather than nation states. So in economic terms, the biggest transnational corporations are actually more powerful than most nations. So for example, if we take a company like Amazon and we look at their annual revenues, which in 2011 were over 34, and we compare that with the gross domestic product of a pretty significant African country, Kenya, which is one of the most developed African countries within Central Eastern Africa, we can see that the GDP for Kenya in that year was significantly less than Amazon's revenues. And in fact, if Amazon was a country rather than a company, it would be the world's 86th biggest country in economic terms. And in economic terms, Walmart, the big American retailer, is bigger than New Zealand. And this country here is Bangladesh, which is one of the most populous countries in the world, yet the gross domestic product of Bangladesh is less than the annual revenues of the American car company General Motors. And I think when it comes to evaluating the impact of transnational corporations, there are two theories that would be broadly positive about their role. And those two theories are neoliberalism and modernisation theory, and they would argue that transnational corporations can provide investment for poorer countries, that they create employment, that they can encourage the development of infrastructure, and that transnational corporations can modernise the economies of developing countries by bringing with them new technology and new ways of working. So both modernisation theory and neoliberalism would reject the idea that transnational corporations are responsible for global inequalities. They would argue that quite the opposite is the case, that transnational corporations actually represent more opportunities for poorer countries, and the fact that transnational corporations have been moving many of their factories from high-income to low-income countries is actually improving living standards within those poorer countries, and therefore leading to a narrowing in the gap between high-income and low-income countries. So their argument would be that transnational corporations are reducing rather than exacerbating global inequalities. And because neoliberals are very keen on the idea of transnational corporations, they argue that poorer countries should establish what are called export processing zones or free trade zones, where transnational corporations are exempt from certain forms of taxation and certain legal restrictions. And therefore these export processing zones are meant to act as a bait to attract transnational corporations into a particular country. However, those people who are critical of export processing zones argue that this leads to a race to the bottom, and that because workers within these export processing zones don't have the same legal protections that other types of workers have, that this amounts to a form of super exploitation. And because about 85% of the workforce within export processing zones are women, this also increases gender inequality. A really interesting film that is critical of the role of transnational corporations is this Canadian documentary called The Corporation. And what this documentary argues is that because transnational corporations have to put profit for their shareholders before any other consideration, that this institution is essentially pathological. And the film actually uses the metaphor of a psychopath to describe the activities and actions of transnational corporations. So in contrast to modernisation theory and neoliberalism, dependency theory would be much more critical about the role of transnational corporations. They would argue that they behave in unethical ways and that transnational corporations increase rather than decrease global inequalities. And the types of issues that they would focus on are the exploitation of workers, for example, the super exploitation of poor women within export processing zones, and the collapse of this garment factory in Bangladesh, leading to the death of more than 1,100 garment workers, has put pressure on some of the big Western brands to sign up to a legally enforceable code of practice to protect the health and safety of workers who work in these sweatshops producing clothes for the Western multinationals. And counter-industrial theories would also be critical of transnational corporations. So, for example, they would argue that one of the problems with transnational corporations isn't just their exploitation of workers, but also their exploitation of the natural environment. And so environmentalists would argue that transnational corporations are toxic organisations that put short-term profit for their shareholders before long-term sustainability of the environment. And a third type of criticism of transnational corporations is the idea that they also exploit their consumers, and they do this through things like misleading advertising and produce dumping. For example, critics of transnational corporations use the terms social washing or greenwashing to describe the deceptive use of marketing to promote to consumers a misleading impression that a company's policies or products are socially and environmentally friendly. So why do transnational corporations behave in unethical and exploitative ways? Well, for dependency theorists such as Cardoso, TNCs are basically the legacy of colonialism. So this is just a continuation of a process of exploitation of poor people and poor countries that goes back to the colonial era. The TNCs are just the latest manifestation of this particular approach. George Soros talks about a problem of market fundamentalism and uncontrolled capitalism. And what he means by this is that the failure of governments to tax and regulate transnational corporations properly has meant that they've become too big, too powerful, and they can now subvert the political process in their own interests. In other words, they can buy politicians and buy elections. And then this last point, this idea of there being a disconnect between transnational corporations and political and legal systems, is the idea that because of their transnational nature, it's very difficult to embed transnational corporations in the moral, legal and political frameworks that other people have to abide by. And in relation to this last point, I think one of the really important issues is the issue of tax havens. And this is an issue that the Financial Times journalist, Nicholas Shaxson, talks about in his brilliant book Treasure Islands. So the argument is that tax is a key weapon in the fight against poverty, and that taxes paid by both companies and individuals enable governments to fund vital public services such as healthcare, education, the provision of clean water and electricity, and to finance anti-poverty programs throughout the world. So when multinational corporations and wealthy individuals fail to pay the tax that they owe, it's the poor who pick up the bill, and it's also going to lead to a situation where poor countries remain dependent on foreign aid. And there's an enormous amount of money hidden in these offshore tax havens. So anywhere between 21 and 32 trillion US dollars. So virtually all of the big multinationals are using tax havens for tax purposes. So as Nicholas Shaxson says, if you were to turn all of that offshore money into dollar bills and lay them end to end, they would stretch to the sun and back many times over. And obviously you can't fit this amount of money into a briefcase. So how does the money actually get to these offshore tax havens? And the answer, of course, is banks. If we take the UK economy, the City of London, the financial services industry plays a really important role in facilitating this kind of tax avoidance. And many of the tax havens around the world are intimately connected to Britain. They're either overseas territories or crown dependencies or former members of the British Commonwealth. And the issues of corporate tax avoidance and UK tax havens is one of the key campaign issues of the NGO umbrella group, the IF campaign, which is a successor to the Make Poverty History campaign.